All right. Okay, that should fix that. There should not be any. No, that's right. Great. All right, good. So, thank you all for coming in this week. There are a lot of fascinating things happening and moving at a very quick pace. About 45 minutes ago, Kynan was just on RT International giving his thoughts as to the situation at Columbia University, the various expulsions, and the fact that Mahmoud Khalil is being deported. We had a very good International Peace Coalition call today where we had on Graham Fuller, Ray McGovern, Senator Richard Black, Mosey Raz, and even a live report from Gaza given by Dr. Feroz Sidwa. And he's there with a friend of the campaign, Dr. Mark Perlmutter. So there has been a lot of activity brewing, and people should also keep an eye out because I will also be doing something a little later. Now, I won't announce that just yet. It hasn't been made public quite yet, but it will be soon. And that'll be in about an hour and a half or so. So with that being said, I kind of just want to get into it. This week is very special. And you're going to want to stick around for this one and for the next weeks as well, too. So we will be keeping you on the edge of your seat. So I'm just going to pass it over to Dennis.
Okay, great. What we're going to be doing is a longer story from Poe. Sometimes it's printed as The Unparalleled Adventures of Hans Pfaall. It's also printed as Hans Pfaall Tale. It's written by Poe at the age of 25, 26. It's published in 1835 and is arguably the beginning, or at least the initiation of the genre that would later get the name science fiction. In the case of Poe, this sort of story follows from what will later become famous as his tales of ratiocination, tales like Murders in the Rue Morgue or Purloined Letter, or in a different vein, The Gold Bug, Mystery of Marie Roget. And these are stories in which he's posing by means of literary devices, philosophical questions and the investigation of philosophical questions, independent of depending upon schools of thought. For example, empiricism, British empiricism, the thinking of David Hume, Locke, Berkeley, people like that, or the German schools, German critical philosophical schools of Kant, Hegel, whom he was very amused by, and others of that ilk. Poe's trying to argue that there's something called hypothesis, and if in that hypothesis alone can lead one to thinking clearly about matters that are otherwise generally restricted to the area of what was called philosophy. So this is a story that also follows from last week. Those of you who were with us last week, we read The Devil in the Belfry. And that story was set in a mythical town, which we argued was actually real. The town was called Wunderwattimatiz, but we argued that it's actually the town of Königsberg, today known as Kaliningrad, and that this is the town inhabited by one Immanuel Kant, and that the story was actually a satire on Kantianism. We didn't really go through it. We didn't discuss the philosophy of Kant. We simply discussed the story, let the story speak on its own. So that story talked about the issue of time. And if you weren't here for that story, we just take a look at it from last week. This week, we're going to take up the issue of space. And so this story, Hans Pfaall, A Tale, or The Unparalleled Adventures of One Hans Pfaall, begins thus. With a heart of furious fancies, whereof I am commander, with a burning spear and a horse of air, to the wilderness I wander. Tom O'Bedlin's song. By late accounts from Rotterdam, that city seems to be in a singularly high state of philosophical excitement. Indeed, phenomena have there occurred of a nature so completely unexpected, so entirely novel, so utterly at variance with preconceived opinions, as to leave no doubt on my mind that long ere this, all Europe is in an uproar, all physics in a ferment, all dynamics and astronomy together by the ears. It appears that on the blank day of blank, I'm not positive about the date, a vast crowd of people, for purposes not specifically mentioned, were assembled in the great square of the exchange in the goodly and well-conditioned city of Rotterdam. The day was warm, unusually so for the season. There was hardly a breath of air stirring, and the multitude were in no bad humor at being, now and then, besprinkled with friendly showers of momentary duration that occasionally fell from large white masses of cloud, which checkered in a fitful manner the blue vault of the firmament. Nevertheless, about noon, a slight but remarkable agitation became apparent in the assembly. The clattering of 10,000 tongues succeeded. And in an instant afterwards, 10,000 faces were upturned towards the heavens. 10,000 pipes descended simultaneously from the corners of 10,000 mouths. And a shout, which could be compared to nothing but the roaring of Niagara, resounded long, loud, and furiously through all the environs of Rotterdam. The origin of this hubbub soon became sufficiently evident. From behind the huge bulk of one of those sharply defined masses of cloud already mentioned was seen slowly to emerge into an open area of blue space a queer, heterogeneous, but apparently solid body or substance, so oddly shaped, so outre in appearance, as not to be in any manner comprehended and never to be sufficiently admired by the host of sturdy burghers who stood open-mouthed and thunderstruck below. What could it be? In the name of all the frauds and devils in Rotterdam, what could it possibly portend? No one knew. No one could imagine. No one, not even the Burgermeister, Mein Herr Superbus von Underduck, had the slightest clue by which to unravel the mystery. So as nothing more reasonable could be done, everyone to a man replaced his pipe carefully in the left corner of his mouth, and cocking up his right eye toward the phenomenon, puffed, paused, waddled about, and grunted significantly, then waddled back, grunted, paused, and finally puffed again. In the meantime, however, lower and still lower towards the goodly city came the object of so much curiosity and the cause of so much smoke. In a very few minutes, it arrived near enough to be accurately discerned. It appeared to be, yes, it was undoubtedly a species of balloon, but surely no such balloon had ever been seen in Rotterdam before. For who, let me ask, ever heard of a balloon entirely manufactured of dirty newspapers? No man in Holland, certainly, yet here under the very noses of the people, or rather, so to speak, at some distance above their noses, was the identical thing in question, and composed, I have it on the best authority, of the precise material which no one had ever known to be used for a similar purpose. It was too bad. It was not to be borne. It was an insult, an egregious insult to the good sense of the burghers of Rotterdam. As to the shape of the phenomenon, it was even still more reprehensible, being little or nothing better than a huge fool's cap turned upside down. And this similitude was by no means lessened when, upon nearer inspection, there was perceived a large tassel descending from its apex, and around the upper rim or base of the cone, a circle of little instruments resembling sheep bells, which kept up a continual tinkling to the tune of Betty Martin. But still worse, suspended by blue ribbons to the end of this fantastic machine, there hung by way of a car an enormous drab beaver hat with a brim superlatively broad and a hemispherical crown with a black band and a silver buckle. It is, however, somewhat remarkable that many citizens of Rotterdam swore to having seen the same hat repeatedly before, and indeed the whole assembly seemed to regard it with eyes of familiarity, while the Frau Gretel Fall, upon sight of it, uttered an exclamation of joyful surprise and declared it to be the identical hat of her good man himself. Now, this was a circumstance the more to be observed as Fall, with 3 companions, had actually disappeared from Rotterdam about 5 years before in a very sudden and unaccountable manner. And up to the date of this narrative, all attempts had failed at obtaining intelligence concerning them whatsoever. To be sure, some bones, which were thought to be human and mixed up with a quantity of odd-looking rubbish, had been lately discovered in a retired situation to the east of Rotterdam. And some people went so far as to imagine that in this spot a foul murder had been committed, and that the sufferers were in all probability Hans Fall and his associates. But to return. You want to pick it up from here?
Sure. Okay. Just making sure. Yep. Okay. The balloon, for such no doubt it was, had now descended to within 100 feet of the earth, allowing the crowd below a sufficiently distinct view of the person of its occupant. This was in truth a very singular somebody. He could not have been more than 2 feet in height, but this altitude, little as it was, would have been sufficient to destroy his equilibrium and tilt him over the edge of his tiny car. But for the intervention of a circular rim reaching as high as the breast and ridged onto the cords of the balloon, the body of the little man was more than large. His hair was gray and collected into a queue behind. His nose was prodigiously long, crooked, and inflammatory. His eyes full, brilliant, and acute. His chin and cheeks, although wrinkled with age, were broad, puffy, and double. But of ears of any kind there was not a semblance to be discovered. Upon any portion of his head, this odd little gentleman was dressed in a loose surtout of sky blue satin, with tight breeches to match, fastened with silver buckles at the knees. His vest was of some bright yellow material. A white taffety cap was set jauntily on one side of his head, and to complete his equipment, a blood-red silk handkerchief enveloped his throat, and fell down in a dainty manner upon his bosom in a fantastic bow knot of supereminent dimensions. Having descended, as I said before, to about 100 feet from the surface of the earth, the little old gentleman was suddenly seized with a fit of trepidation, and appeared disinclined to make any nearer approach to terra firma. Throwing out, therefore, a quantity of sand from a canvas bag, which he lifted with great difficulty, he became stationary in an instant. He then proceeded in a hurried and agitated manner to extract from a side pocket in his surtout a large morocco pocketbook. This he poised suspiciously in his hand, then eyed it with an air of extreme surprise, and was evidently astonished at its weight. He at length opened it, and drawing therefrom a huge letter sealed with red sealing wax and tied carefully with red tape, let it fall precisely at the feet of the burgomaster's Superbus von Underduk. His Excellency stooped to take it up, but the aeronaut, still greatly discomposed, and having apparently no further business to detain him in Rotterdam, began at this moment to make busy preparations for departure, and it being necessary to discharge a portion of ballast to enable him to reascend the half-dozen bags which he threw out,
Sand which he threw out. Oh, yeah.
We have ours is different in several places.
Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'll have people use my book because it'll be other. So he's throwing out a half dozen bags of sand. Okay.
Okay. Sorry, I lost my place. Superbus von Underduk, half dozen bags, right? Oh, sand.
Yeah.
Which he threw out, one after another, without taking the trouble to empty their contents, tumbled, every one of them, most unfortunately, upon the back of the burgomaster, and rolled him over and over no less than half a dozen times in the face of every individual in Rotterdam. It is not to be supposed, however, that the great underduck suffered this impertinence on the part of the little old man to pass off with impunity. It is said, on the contrary, that during each of his half dozen circumvolutions, he emitted no less than half a dozen distinct and furious whiffs from his pipe, to which he held fast the whole time with all his might, and to which he intends holding fast, God willing, until the day of his decease. In the meantime, the balloon arose like a lark, and soaring far away above the city, at length drifted quietly behind a cloud similar to that from which it had so oddly emerged, and was thus lost forever to the wondering eyes of the good citizens of Rotterdam. All attention was now directed to the letter, the descent of which, and the consequences attending thereupon, had proved so fatally subversive of both person and personal dignity to His Excellency von Underduck. That functionary, however, had not failed, during his circumgyratory movements, to bestow a thought upon the important object of securing the epistle, which was
a letter,
which was seen, upon inspection, to have fallen into the most proper hands, being actually addressed to himself and Professor Rubadub.
No, Rubadub.
Professor Rubadub, in their official capacities of president and vice president of the Rotterdam College of Astronomy. It was accordingly opened by those dignitaries upon the spot, and found to contain the following extraordinary and indeed very serious communication.
Tiny, you want to pick up? You use my book. I'm going to... To their excellencies, because they'll see the differences. And for people who are watching this online who may not have noticed this before, we often talk about the differences in the editions. You'll hear. Go ahead.
To their excellencies von Underduck and Rubadub, President and Vice President of the State's College of Astronomers in the city of Rotterdam. Your excellencies may perhaps be able to remember an humble artisan by name Hans Pfaall, and by occupation a mender of bellows, who, with 3 others, disappeared from Rotterdam about 5 years ago, in a manner which must have been considered by all parties at once sudden and extremely unaccountable. If, however, it so please your excellencies, I, the writer of this communication, am the identical Hans Pfaall himself. It is well known to most of my fellow citizens that for the period of 40 years I continued to occupy the little square brick building at the head of the alley called Sauerkraut, and in which I resided at the time of my disappearance. My ancestors have also resided therein time out of mind, they, as well as myself, steadily following the respectable and indeed lucrative profession of mending of bellows. For, to speak the truth, until of late years, that the heads of all the people have been set agog with the troubles and politics, no better business than my own could an honest citizen of Rotterdam either desire or deserve. Credit was good, employment was never wanting, and on all hands there was no lack of either money or goodwill. But, as I was saying, we soon began to feel the terrible effects of liberty, and long speeches, and radicalism, and all that sort of thing. People who were formerly the very best customers in the world had now not a moment of time to think of us at all. They had, so they said, as much as they could do to read about the revolutions and keep up with the march of intellect and the spirit of the age. If a fire wanted fanning, it could readily be fanned with a newspaper. And as the government grew weaker, I have no doubt that leather and iron acquired durability in proportion. For, in a very short time, there was not a pair of bellows in all Rotterdam that ever stood in need of a stitch or required the assistance of a hammer. This was a state of things not to be endured. I soon grew as poor as a rat, and, having a wife and children to provide for, my burdens at length became intolerable, and I spent hour after hour in reflecting upon the speediest and most convenient method of putting an end to my life. Duns, in the meantime, left me little leisure for contemplation. My house was literally besieged from morning till night, so that I began to rave and foam and fret like a caged tiger against the bars of his enclosure. There were 3 fellows in particular who worried me beyond endurance, keeping watch continually about my door and threatening me with the uttermost severity of the law. Upon these 3 I internally vowed the bitterest revenge, if ever I should be so happy as to get them within my clutches. And I believe nothing in the world but the pleasure of this anticipation prevented me from putting my plan of suicide into immediate execution by blowing my brains out with a blunderbuss. I thought it best, however, to dissemble my wrath and to treat them with promises and fair words until, by some good turn of fate, an opportunity of vengeance should be afforded me. One day, having given my creditors the slip, and feeling more than usually dejected, I continued for a long time to wander about the most obscure streets without any object whatever, until at length I chanced to stumble against the corner of a bookseller's stall. Seeing a chair close at hand for the use of customers, I threw myself doggedly into it, and, hardly knowing why, opened the pages of the first volume which came within my reach. It proved to be a small pamphlet treatise on speculative astronomy, written either by Professor Encke of Berlin or by a Frenchman of somewhat similar name. I had some little tincture of information on matters of this nature, and soon became more and more absorbed in the contents of the book, reading it actually through twice before I awoke, as it were, to a recollection of what was passing around me. By this time it began to grow dark, and I directed my steps toward home. But the treatise had made an indelible impression on my mind, and, as I sauntered along the dusky streets, I resolved carefully over in my memory the wild and sometimes unintelligible reasonings of the writer. There were some particular passages which affected my imagination in a power and extraordinary manner. The longer I meditated upon these, the more intense grew the interest which had been excited within me. The limited nature of my education in general, and more especially my ignorance on subjects connected with natural philosophy, so far from rendering me diffident of my own ability to comprehend what I had read, or including me to mistrust the many vague notions which had arisen in consequence, merely served as a farther stimulus to imagination. And I was vain enough, or perhaps reasonable enough, to doubt whether those crude ideas which, arising in ill-regulated minds, have all the appearance, may not often in effect possess also the force, the reality, and other inherent properties of instinct or intuition, and whether to proceed a step farther, profundity itself might not, in matters of a purely speculative nature, be detected as a legitimate source of falsity and error. In other words, I believed, and still do believe, that truth is frequently, of its own essence, superficial, and that, in many cases, the depth lies more in the abysses where we seek her than in the actual situations wherein she may be found. Nature herself seemed to afford me corroboration of these ideas. In the contemplation of the heavenly bodies, it struck me very forcibly that I could not distinguish a star with nearly as much precision when I gazed upon it with earnest, direct, and undeviating attention as when I suffered my eye only to glance in its vicinity alone. I was not, of course, at that time aware that this apparent paradox was occasioned by the center of the visual area being less susceptible of feeble impressions of light than the exterior portions of the retina. This knowledge, and some of another kind, came afterwards in the course of an eventful period of 5 years, during which I have dropped the prejudices of my former humble situation in life, and forgotten the bellows mender and far different occupations. But at the epoch of which I speak, the analogy which the casual observation of a star offered, the conclusions I had already drawn struck me with the force of positive confirmation, and I then finally made up my mind to the course which I afterwards pursued.
Lynn, you want to do it?
Yeah. So just show me where you are.
Right.
Yeah.
Make sure you can see it.
It was late when I reached home. Second
Okay.
paragraph.
We're missing that whole lot.
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah,
what the-
good.
I,
Right.
Yeah,
I was
that's
trying to-
Really?
I was trying to
Yeah.
fix it on this thing. I was like, wait.
We're good.
Yeah, I was like, where is that?
We're good. It's all. And
Yeah,
I guess and everybody watching it there.
Yeah, they just saw me jumping around. Like, did I miss something?
Okay, yeah. So people, just so people know who are watching, Jose just pointed out that the whole last paragraph is not in the edition that you're seeing on the screen, which just goes to show that it's who you know in life that counts, I guess.
So
Okay.
where are we picking up from? It was,
It was late when I reached home,
You see it?
yeah.
Okay, great.
and I went immediately to bed. My mind, however, was too much occupied to sleep, and I lay the whole night buried in meditation. Arising early in the morning and continuing again to escape the vigilance of my creditors, I repaired eagerly to the bookseller's stall and laid out what little ready money I possessed, and in the purchase of some volumes of mechanics and practical astronomy. Having arrived at home safely with these, I devoted every spare moment to their perusal, and soon made such proficiency in studies of this nature that I thought sufficient for the execution of my plan. In the intervals of this period, I made every endeavor to conciliate the three creditors which had given me so much annoyance. In this, I finally succeeded, partly by selling enough of my household furniture to satisfy a moiety of their claim, and partly by the promise of paying the balance upon completion of a little project, which I told them I had in view, and for assistance in which I solicited their services. By these means, for they were ignorant men, I found little difficulty in gaining them over to my purpose. Matters being thus arranged, I contrived, by the aid of my wife, and with the greatest secrecy and caution, to dispose of what property I had remaining, and to borrow in small sums under various pretenses, and without paying any attention to my future means of repayment, no inconsiderable quantity of ready money. With the means thus accruing, I proceeded to purchase at intervals cambric muslin, very fine, in pieces of 12 yards each, twine, a lot of the varnish of caoutchouc, a large deep basket of wicker work made to order, and several other articles necessary in the construction and equipment of a balloon of extraordinary dimensions. This I directed my wife to make up as soon as possible, and gave her all the requisite information as to the particular method of proceeding. In the meantime, I worked up the twine into a network of sufficient dimensions, rigged it with a hoop and the necessary cords, bought a quadrant, a compass, a spyglass, a common barometer with some important modifications, and two astronomical instruments not so generally known. I then took the opportunities of conveying by night to a retired situation east of Rotterdam 5 iron-bound casks to contain about 50 gallons each, and one of a larger size, 6 tin war tubes, 3 inches in diameter, properly shaped, and 10 feet in length, a quantity of a particular metallic substance or semi-metal, which I shall not name, and a dozen demijohns of a very common acid. The gas to be formed from these latter materials is a gas never yet generated by any other person than myself, or at least never applied to a similar purpose. The secret I can only venture to say here, that It is a constituent of azote, so long considered irreducible, and that its density is about 37.4 times less than that of hydrogen. It is tasteless, but not odorless, burns when pure with a greenish flame, and is instantaneously fatal to animal life. Its full secret I would make no difficulty in disclosing, but that it of right belongs to the citizens of Nantes in France, by whom it was conditionally communicated to myself. The same individual submitted to me, without being at all aware of my intentions, a method of constructing balloons from the membrane of a certain animal through which any escape of gas was nearly an impossibility. I found it, however, altogether too expensive, and was not sure upon the whole whether cambric muslin with a coating of gum choucroute was not equally as good. I mention this circumstance because I think it probable that hereafter the individual in question may attempt a balloon ascension with the novel gas and material I have spoken of, and I do not wish to deprive him of the honor of a very singular invention. On the spot, which I intended each of the smaller casks to occupy, respectively, during the inflation of the balloon, I privately dug a hole 2 feet deep, the holes forming in this manner a circle of 25 feet in diameter. In the center of this circle, being the station designed for the large cask, I also dug a hole 3 feet in depth. In each of the 5 smaller holes, I deposited a canister containing 50 pounds, and in the larger one, a keg holding 150 pounds of cannon powder. These, the keg and the canister, I connected to a proper manner which covered trains, and having let into one of the canisters the end of about 4 feet of slow match, I covered up the hole and placed the cask over it, leaving the other end of the match protruding about an inch and barely visible beyond the cask. I then filled up the remaining holes and placed the barrels over them in their destined situation. Beside the articles above enumerated, I conveyed to the depot and then secreted one of M. Grimm's improvements upon the apparatus for the condensation of the atmospheric air. I found this machine, however, to require considerable attention before it could be adapted to the purposes for which I intended making it applicable. But with severe labor and unremitting perseverance, I at length met with the entire success of all my preparations. My balloon was soon completed. It would contain more than 40,000 cubic feet of gas, would take me up, I calculated, easily with all my implements, and if I managed rightly, with 175 pounds of ballast into the bargain. And if I managed rightly, with 175 pounds of ballast into the bargain. It had received 3 coats of varnish, and I found the cambric muslin to answer all the purposes of silk itself, quite as strong and a good deal less expensive.
Okay, let's stop for a minute. This is reference one thing so people know this. Through the fall of 1827, so he would have been 18 years old, Edgar Poe remained in Boston at Fort Independence, but in November relocated to Fort Moultrie, South Carolina. There he prepared shells for artillery and seemed to flourish. 13 months later, he transferred again, this time to Fortress Monroe at the entrance to Chesapeake Bay. After just 2 years of military service, Poe attained the rank of Sergeant Major for artillery, the highest enlisted rank open to him. Then abruptly, he found a substitute and quit the army, to pursue an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. So that's important to understand, because what we're reading has no reason for this detail
Mhm.
unless this is actually referring to something which is actually being done. And this story is written in 1835. Fenimore Cooper and Morse are both in Paris in 1832, where they're holding meetings with Lafayette. And while, again, there is a dispute as to whether Poe ever went to Paris, which Alexander Dumas, at least one story, which is said to be apocryphal, indicates. What is the case is that communications concerning scientific matters between Paris and the Society of the Cincinnatus would have been occurring. Because remember, Samuel Morse, besides being a painter, is the inventor of Morse code. So keep this in mind, just because in reading, in doing that, the question is, okay, if this is just a story, how come he just
Mhm.
what's all the detail about? Okay. Does somebody
Okay.
want to pick up?
Yeah.
Adrian, you want to read? And you can use either your copy or this one. It doesn't matter. Okay.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's right here.
Here,
Where, Lynn?
everything.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything. Being
Everything. He's got
Yeah.
it. He's got
Everything
it.
now being
Okay,
ready.
great. Everything being now ready, I exacted from my wife an oath of secrecy in relation to all my actions from the day of my first visit to the bookseller's stall, and promising on my part to return as soon as circumstances would admit, I gave her all the money I had left and bade her farewell. Indeed, I had little fear on her account. She was what people call a notable woman and could manage matters in the world without my assistance. I believe, to tell the truth, she always looked upon me as an idle body, a mere make-weight, good for nothing but building castles in the air, and was rather glad to get rid of me. It was a dark night when I bade her goodbye, and taking with me as aide-de-camp the three creditors who had given me so much trouble, we carried the balloon with the car and accoutrements by a roundabout way to the station where the other articles were deposited. We there found them all unmolested, and I proceeded immediately to business. It was the 1st of April. The night, as I said before, was dark. There was not a star to be seen, and a drizzling of rain falling at intervals rendered us very uncomfortable. But my chief anxiety was concerning my balloon, which, in spite of the varnish with which it was defended, began to grow rather heavy with the moisture. My powder was also liable to damage. I therefore kept my 3 duns working with great diligence, pounding down ice around the central cask and stirring the acid in the others. They did not cease, however, importuning me with questions as to what I intended to do with all this apparatus, and expressed much dissatisfaction at the terrible labor I made them undergo. They could not perceive, so they said, what good was likely to result from their getting wet to the skin, merely to take a part in such horrible incantations. I began to get uneasy and worked away with all my might. For I verily believe the idiots supposed that I had entered into a compact with the devil, and that in short, what I was now doing was nothing better than it should be. I was therefore in great fear of their leaving me altogether. I contrived, however, to pacify them by promises of immediate payment as soon as I could bring the present business to a termination. To these speeches they gave, of course, their own interpretation, fancying, no doubt, that at all events I should come into possession of vast quantities of ready money. And provided I paid them all I owed, and a trifle more, in consideration of their services, I dare say they cared very little what became of either my soul or my carcass. In about 4 hours and a half, I found the balloon sufficiently inflated, I attached the car, therefore, and put all my implements in it, not forgetting the condensing apparatus, a copious supply of water, and a large quantity of provisions, such as pemmican, in which much nutriment is contained in comparatively little bulk. I also secured in the car a pair of pigeons and a cat. It was now nearly daybreak, and I thought it high time to take my departure. Dropping a lighted cigar on the ground as if by accident, I took the opportunity, in stooping to pick it up, of igniting privately the piece of slow match, whose end, as I said before, protruded a very little beyond the lower rim of one of the smaller casks. This maneuver was totally unperceived on the part of the 3 Duns, and, jumping into the car, I immediately cut the single cord which held me to the earth, and was pleased to find that I shot upwards rapidly, carrying with all ease 175 pounds of leaden ballast, and able to have carried up as many more. Scarcely, however, had I attained the height of 50 yards, when, roaring and rumbling up after me in the most horrible and tumultuous manner, came so dense a hurricane of fire and smoke and sulphur and legs and arms and gravel and burning wood and blazing metal, that my very heart sunk within me, and I fell down in the bottom of the car, trembling with unmitigated terror. Indeed, I now perceived that I had entirely overdone the business, and that the main consequences of the shock were yet to be experienced. Accordingly, in less than a second, I felt all the blood in my body rushing to my temples, and immediately thereupon a concussion, which I shall never forget, burst abruptly through the night and seemed to rip the very firmament asunder. When I afterwards had time for reflection, I did not fail to attribute the extreme violence of the explosion, as regarded myself, to its proper cause, my situation directly above it, and in the exact line of its greatest power. But at the time, I thought only of preserving my life. The balloon at first collapsed, then furiously expanded, then whirled around and round with horrible velocity, and finally, reeling and staggering like a drunken man, hurled me with great force over the rim of the car, and left me dangling at a terrific height, with my head downwards and my face outwards from the balloon, by a piece of slender cord about 3 feet in length, which hung accidentally through a crevice near the bottom of the wickerwork, and in which, as I fell, my left foot became most providentially entangled. It is impossible, utterly impossible, to form any adequate idea of the horror of my situation. I gasped convulsively for breath. A shudder resembling a fit of the ague agitated every nerve and muscle in my frame. I felt my eyes starting from their sockets. A horrible nausea overwhelmed me. My brain reeled, and I fainted away. How long I remained in this state it is impossible to say. It must, however, have been no inconsiderable time, for when at length I partially recovered the sense of existence, I found the day breaking, and the balloon at a prodigious height over a wilderness of ocean, and not a trace of land to be discovered far and wide within the limits of the vast horizon. My senses, however, upon thus recovering, were by no means so rife with agony as might have been anticipated. Indeed, there was much of incipient madness in the calm survey which I began to take of my situation.
Let me just ask you a question. I see you outside the car now. Is he still upside down, or did he get inside, or what exactly happened here?
I think he's still just dangling there.
Dangling. Okay, fine.
He just fell asleep dangling.
He just went to sleep. Okay,
Yeah.
fine.
By his 1 foot. Yeah.
Okay.
Did the guys at the bottom, his helpers, blow up?
No. Well, he just got away from him. These were his
but
predators.
In my copy, it said limbs and other stuff was like flying around.
Well, that may be
I
what
thought
the
they
dead
had blown
bones that
up.
we heard about it from the beginning is probably what that's going to be.
Yeah,
Predators.
Yeah,
yeah,
the dead bones of the predators.
okay.
Indeed, there was much of incipient madness in the calm survey which I began to take of my situation. I drew up to my eyes each of my hands, one after the other, and wondered what occurrence could have given rise to the swelling of the veins and the horrible blackness of the fingernails. I afterwards carefully examined my head, shaking it repeatedly, and feeling it with minute attention until I succeeded in satisfying myself that it was not, as I had more than half suspected, larger than my balloon. Then, in a knowing manner, I felt in both my breeches pockets, and missing therefrom a set of tablets and a toothpick case, I endeavored to account for their disappearance, and not being able to do so, felt inexpressibly chagrined. It now occurred to me that I suffered great uneasiness in the joint of my left ankle, and a dim consciousness of my situation began to glimmer through my mind. But strange to say, I was neither astonished nor horror-stricken. If I felt any emotion at all, it was a kind of chuckling satisfaction at the cleverness I was about to display in extricating myself from this dilemma. And I never for a moment looked upon my ultimate safety as a question susceptible of doubt. For a few moments I remained wrapped in the profoundest meditation. I have a distinct recollection of frequently compressing my lips, putting my forefinger to the side of my nose, and making use of other gesticulations and grimaces common to men who, at ease in their armchairs, meditate upon matters of intricacy or importance. Having, as I thought, sufficiently collected my ideas, I now, with great caution and deliberation, put my hands behind my back and unfastened the large iron buckle which belonged to the waistband of my inexpressibles. This buckle had 3 teeth, which, being somewhat rusty, turned with great difficulty upon their axis. I brought them, however, after some trouble, at right angles to the body of the buckle, and was glad to find them remain firm in that position. Holding the instrument thus obtained within my teeth, I now proceeded to untie the knot of my cravat. I had to rest several times before I could accomplish this maneuver, but it was at length accomplished. To one end of the cravat, I then made fast the buckle, and the other end I tied, for greater security, tightly around my wrist. Drawing now my body upwards with a prodigious exertion of muscular force, I succeeded at the very first trial in throwing the buckle over the car and entangling it as I had anticipated in the circular rim of the wickerwork. Someone else want to jump in?
Yeah. Anybody? Where are we?
We are my body.
Okay. I'll do it. My body was now inclined toward the side of the car at an angle of about 45 degrees. But it must not be understood that I was therefore only 45 degrees below the perpendicular. So far from it, I still lay nearly level with the plane of the horizon, for the change of situation which I had acquired had forced the bottom of the car considerably outwards from my position, which was accordingly one of the most imminent and dangerous peril. It should be remembered, however, that when I fell, in the first instance, from the car, if I had fallen with my face turned toward the balloon instead of turned outwardly from it, as it actually was, or if, in the second place, the cord by which I was suspended had chanced to hang over the upper edge instead of through a crevice near the bottom of the car, I say it may readily be conceived that in either of those supposed cases, I should have been unable to accomplish even as much as I had now accomplished. And the wonderful adventures of Hans Pfaall would have been utterly lost to posterity. I had therefore every reason to be grateful, although in point of fact, I was still too stupid to be anything at all, and hung for, I suppose, a quarter of an hour in that extraordinary manner without making the slightest farther exertion whatsoever, and in a singularly tranquil state of idiotic enjoyment. But this feeling did not fail to die rapidly away, and thereunto succeeded horror and dismay and a chilling sense of utter helplessness and ruin. In fact, the blood so long accumulating in the vessels of my head and throat, and which had hitherto buoyed up my spirits with madness and delirium, had now begun to retire within their proper channels, And the distinctness which was thus added to my perception of the danger merely served to deprive me of the self-possession and courage to encounter it. But this weakness was, luckily for me, of no very long duration. In good time came to my rescue the spirit of despair, and amid horrible curses and convulsive struggles, I jerked my way bodily upwards till at length, clutching with a vice-like grip the long-desired rim, I writhed my person over it and fell headlong and shuddering within the car. It was not until some time afterwards that I recovered myself sufficiently to attend to the ordinary cares of the balloon. I then, however, examined it with attention and found it, to my great relief, uninjured. My implements were all safe, and I had fortunately lost neither ballast nor provisions. Indeed, I had so well secured them in their places that such an accident was entirely out of the question. Looking at my watch, I found it 6 o'clock. I was still rapidly ascending, and my barometer showed a present altitude of 3 3/4 miles. Immediately beneath me in the ocean lay a small black object, slightly oblong in shape, seemingly about the size and in every way bearing a great resemblance to one of those childish toys called a domino. Bringing my spyglass to bear upon it, I plainly discerned it to be a British 94-gun ship, close hauled and pitching heavily in the sea with her head to the west-southwest. Besides this ship, I saw nothing but the ocean and the sky and the sun, which had long arisen. It is now high time that I should explain to your excellencies the object of my perilous voyage. Your excellencies will bear in mind that distressed circumstances in Rotterdam had at length driven me to the resolution of committing suicide. It was not, however, that to life itself I had any positive disgust, but that I was harassed beyond endurance by the adventitious miseries attending my situation. In this state of mind, wishing to live, yet wearied with life, the treatise at the stall of the bookseller opened a source to my imagination. I then finally made up my mind. I determined to depart, yet live, to leave the world, yet continue to exist. In short, to drop enigmas, I resolved, let what would ensue, to force a passage, if I could, to the moon. Now, lest I should be supposed more of a madman than I actually am, I will detail, as well as I am able, the considerations which led me to believe that an achievement of this nature, although without doubt difficult and incontestably full of danger, was not absolutely to a bold spirit beyond the confines of the possible. Jose, I'm going to do another paragraph and then you pick it up because you got the moon's actual distance from the earth was the first thing to be attended to. Now, the mean or average interval between the centers of the two planets is 59.9643 of the Earth's equatorial radii, or only about 237,000 miles. I say the mean or average interval. But it must be borne in mind that the form of the moon's orbit being an ellipse of eccentricity amounting to no less than 0.05454 of the major semi-axis of the ellipse itself, and the Earth's center being situated in its focus, if I could in any manner contrive to meet the moon, as it were, in its perigee, the closest point to the Earth, the above-mentioned distance would be materially diminished. But to say nothing at present of this possibility, it was very certain that at all events, from the 237,000 miles, I should have to deduct the radius of the Earth, say 4,000, and the radius of the moon, say 1080, in all 5,080, leaving an actual interval to be traversed under average circumstances of 231,920 miles. Now this, I reflected, was no very extraordinary distance. Traveling on land has been repeatedly accomplished at the rate of 30 miles per hour, and indeed a much greater speed may be anticipated. But even at this velocity, it would take me no more than 322 days to reach the surface of the moon. There were, however, many particulars inducing me to believe that my average rate of traveling might possibly very much exceed that of 30 miles per hour. And as these considerations did not fail to make a deep impression upon my mind, I will mention them more fully hereafter. Okay, here we go.
Okay. You said 161 days.
At 60 miles an hour.
Yeah, he's gonna be able to get there. Right? He's gonna move.
All right. So we're
Right there. Right there.
okay. Oh, I see. The next.
The next, yeah.
The next point to be regarded was a matter of far greater importance, from indications afforded by the barometer. We find that in ascensions from the surface of the earth, we have, at the height of 1,000 feet, left below us about 1/30th of the entire mass of atmospheric air, that at 10,600, we have ascended through nearly 1/3, and that at 18,000, which is not far from the elevation of Cotopaxi. We have surmounted 1/2 of the material, or at all events, 1/2 the ponderable body of air incumbent upon our globe. It is also calculated that an altitude not exceeding the 100th part of the Earth's diameter, that is, not exceeding 80 miles, the rarefaction would be so excessive that animal life could in no manner be sustained, and, moreover, that the most delicate means we possess of ascertaining the presence of the atmosphere would be inadequate to assure us of its existence. But I did not fail to perceive that these latter calculations are founded altogether on our experimental knowledge of the properties of air, and the mechanical laws regulating its dilation and compression, in what may be called, comparatively speaking, the immediate vicinity of the earth itself, and at the same time it is taken for granted that animal life is and must be essentially incapable of modification at any given unattainable distance from the surface. Now, all such reasoning and from such data must of course be simply analogical. The greatest height ever reached by man was that of 25,000 feet, attained in the aeronautic expedition of Monsieur Gay-Lussac and Biot. This is a moderate altitude, even when compared with the 80 miles in question, and I could not help thinking that the subject admitted room for doubt and great latitude for speculation. Is that a real event he's citing there? Okay, so like this, okay. But in point of fact, an ascension being made to any stated altitude, the ponderable quantity of air surmounted in any farther ascension is by no means in proportion to the additional height as ascended, as may be plainly seen from what has been stated before, but in a ratio constantly decreasing. It is therefore evident that ascend as high as we may, we cannot, literally speaking, arrive at a limit beyond which no atmosphere is to be found. It must exist, I argued. It may exist in a state of infinite rarefaction. On the other hand, I was aware that arguments have not been wanting to prove the existence of a real and definite limit to the atmosphere, beyond which there is absolutely no air whatsoever, but a circumstance which has been left out of view by those who contend for such a limit seemed to me, although no positive refutation of the creed, still a point worthy of very serious investigation. On comparing the intervals between the successive arrivals of Encke's comet at its perihelion, after giving credit in the most exact manner for all the disturbances or perturbations due to the attractions of the planets, it appears that the periods are gradually diminishing. That is to say, the major axis of the comet's ellipse is growing shorter, in a slow but perfectly regular decrease. Now, this is precisely what ought to be the case. If we suppose a resistance experienced by the comet from an extremely rare ethereal medium pervading the regions of its orbit, for it is evident that such a medium must, in retarding its velocity, increase its centripetal by weakening its centrifugal force. In other words, the sun's attraction would be constantly attaining greater power, and the comet would be drawn nearer at every revolution. Indeed, there is no other way of accounting for the variation in question. But again, the real diameter of the same comet's nebulosity is observed to contract rapidly as it approaches the sun, and dilate with equal rapidity in its departure towards its aphelion. Was I not justifiable in supposing, with M. Balls, that this apparent condensation of volume has its origin in the compression of the same ethereal medium I have spoken of before, and which is only denser in proportion to its solar vicinity? The lenticular shaped phenomenon, also called the zodiacal light, was a matter worthy of attention. Its radiance, so apparent in the tropics, and which cannot be mistaken for any meteoric luster, extends from the horizon obliquely upwards and follows generally the direction of the sun's equator. It appeared to me evidently in the nature of a rare atmosphere extending from the sun outwards, beyond the orbit of Venus at least, and I believe indefinitely farther. Indeed, this medium I could not suppose confined to the path of the comet's ellipse, or the immediate neighborhood of the sun. It was easy, on the contrary, to imagine it pervading to the entire regions of our planetary system, condensed into what we call atmosphere at the planets themselves, and in some of them modified by considerations, so to speak, purely geological. Someone want to take over? It's 7:05.
Yeah, let's go to another 10 minutes, right?
Okay, sure.
Enough?
Yeah.
Anybody want to, Kynan, you want to take it? Yeah. And what we'll do is we'll try to conclude it with the this description.
We have having adopted this view of the subject. Oh shit, I didn't.
Oh, you didn't change it?
We'll
Change the text so people can follow.
I think so. Oh, yeah, we weren't that far.
Okay, great. Fine.
Okay. Having adopted this view of the subject, I had little farther hesitation. Granting that on my passage I should meet with atmosphere essentially the same at the surface of the earth, I conceived that, by means of the very ingenious apparatus of M. Grimm, I should readily be enabled to condense it in sufficient quantities for the purposes of respiration. This would remove the chief obstacle in a journey to the moon. I had indeed spent some money and great labor in adapting the apparatus to the purposes intended, and I confidently looked forward to its successful application if I could manage to complete the voyage within any reasonable period. This brings me back to the rate at which it might be possible to travel. It is true that balloons, in the first stage of their ascensions from the earth, are known to rise with a velocity comparatively moderate. Now, the power of elevation lies altogether in the superior lightness of the gas in the balloon compared with the atmospheric air, and, at first sight, it does not appear probable that, as the balloon acquires altitude, and consequently arrives successfully in atmospheric strata of densities rapidly diminishing, I say, it does not appear at all reasonable that in this its progress upwards, the original velocity should be accelerated. On the other hand, I was not aware that in any recorded ascension, a diminution was apparent in the absolute rate of ascent, although such should have been the case, if on account of nothing else, on account of the escape of gas through balloons ill-constructed and varnished with no better material than the ordinary varnish. It seemed, therefore, that the effect of such an escape was only sufficient to counterbalance the effect of some accelerating power. I now considered that, provided in my passage I found the medium I had imagined, and provided it should prove to be actually and essentially what we denominate atmospheric air, it could make comparatively little difference at what extreme state of rarefaction I should discover it. That is to say, in regard to my power of ascending, for the gas in the balloon would not only be itself subject to a rarefaction partially similar, but, being what it was, would still, at all events, continue specifically lighter than any compound whatever of mere nitrogen and oxygen. Thus there was a chance, in fact there was a strong probability, that at no epoch of my ascent I should reach a point where the united weights of my immense balloon, the inconceivably rare gas within it, the car and its contents, should equal the weight of the mass of the surrounding atmosphere displaced. And this will be readily understood as the sole condition upon which my upward flight would be arrested. But, if this point were even attained, I could dispense with ballast and other weight to the amount of nearly 300 pounds. In the meantime, the force of gravitation would be constantly diminishing in proportion to the squares of the distances, and thus, with a velocity prodigiously accelerating, I should at length arrive in those distant regions where the power of the Earth's attraction would be superseded by the moon's. In accordance with these ideas, I did not think it worthwhile to encumber myself with more provisions than would be sufficient for a period of 40 days. There was still, however, another difficulty which occasioned me some little disquietude. It has been observed that in all balloon ascensions to any considerable height, besides the pain attending respiration, great uneasiness is invariably experienced about the head and body, often accompanied with bleeding at the nose and other symptoms of an alarming kind, and growing more and more inconvenient in proportion to the altitude attained. This was a reflection of a nature somewhat startling. Was it not probable that these symptoms would increase indefinitely, or at least until terminated by death itself? I finally thought not. Their origins was to be looked for in the progressive removal of the customary atmospheric pressure upon the surface of the body and consequent distension of the superficial blood vessels, not in any positive disorganization of the animal system, as in the case of difficulty in breathing, where the atmospheric density is chemically insufficient for the purpose of a due renovation of blood in a ventricle of the heart. Unless for default of this renovation, I could see no reason, therefore, why life could not be sustained even in a vacuum. For the expansion and compression of chest, commonly called breathing, is action purely muscular, and the cause, not the effect, of respiration. In a word, I conceive that as the body should become habituated to the want of atmospheric pressure, these sensations of pain would gradually diminish, and to endure them while they continued, I relied strongly upon the iron hardihood of my constitution. Thus, it may please your excellencies, I have detailed some, though by no means all, the considerations which led me to form the project of a lunar voyage. I shall now proceed to lay before you the result of an attempt so apparently audacious in conception, and, at all events, so utterly unparalleled in the annals of humankind.
Okay, so let's do the following. We've now begun this story. There's a lot that one could discuss. This clearly is a different Edgar Poe than people would assume.
Yeah.
The story has, by the way, at least in my book, I don't know if it has yours, a 4-page note at the end. You have that in yours?
I remember seeing something long.
Go to the end and see if it has a note.
Yeah, it does. And I think the note, strictly speaking, there is but little similarity between the above sketchy trifle and the celebrated Boone story.
Yeah, because he's going to show, well, I won't go through what it is. Okay, I just want to make sure it's there.
Oh, the note is still a part of the...
Yeah.
Of the narrative.
Well, it is, but it isn't. The point of the thing is this is I won't say more, but he writes this, as I say, he's 26 years old.
And what year is he?
1835. Okay? So I would propose that what people might do is look up the year, look up what else is going on in the United States in the way of scientific exploration, look up the figures, Fenimore Cooper and Samuel Morse in particular. Okay. And we should continue the story next week.
I don't know if it's jumping ahead, but you had mentioned the connection with the military, and the first.
Why don't you just come up to the chair if you're going to say something so people can see you? And
we had mentioned Poe's role in terms of the U.S. military, and just one thing of note is the first time that aerial reconnaissance is used in the U.S. for balloons is during the Civil War, and it was used both in terms of the Union forces as well as the Confederacy, much more extensively. They actually had like a balloon corps where they had a number of balloons that were used for reconnaissance. And I think it was Grant or Lee or both of them, because whenever you're fighting a battle, is if you can get the high ground, like from a high hill or mountain, and you can overlook the entire terrain. That's what people were fighting to get at in for example, in the famous story in Gettysburg, Little Round Top, and then the other mountain that actually the Union forces captured. What's the name of the general? Trying to think. But anyway, he got there early and recognized.
Or Cornwallis.
No. This in the Civil War.
On Civil War, yeah, but the first use
Yeah.
of balloons, by the way, is in 1794.
Right, in France.
Yeah.
But the first time they're used in the U.S. militarily is during
Right.
the Civil War. That was my point. So anyway, it makes sense to have maybe Poe was a big proponent of being able to do that.
Well, what's clearly the case is that French science is of great interest to the Americans because of West Point, which is all modeled on the École Polytechnique and is built in conjunction with the legacy of Lazare Carnot and the École Polytechnique from the 1790s. This sort of important to look at, but I'm inviting, rather than us talk about it here, it would be interesting for people to just look some of this stuff up. It's also the case that you might check, because there would be articles that we've written about this that are also probably available in some of the old Executive Intelligence Review locations, and we might contact our French organization to think about this a bit. But in any case, the reason I'll just repeat, we keep saying that Edgar Poe is a military intelligence agent, that he became that in his late teens, that he was seconded to West Point and was seconded to the American Society of the Cincinnatus from the age of 15 when he met the Marquis de Lafayette. But I just think, because we have some other things that are happening this evening, we are going to stop now. I would certainly invite people to go ahead and read the rest of the story.
Yeah.
I mean, that you can do that, before next week, and maybe we can take up particularly some of the detail of what he's gone through here. Especially because this is not different. I would argue, without asserting it here right now, than the murders in the Rue Morgue.
Okay, I'm ending the screen.